Today we're going to see the influence that Hesed had on Abraham's family, and we're also going to see the first instance of Hesed being used in relationship between man and God. So let's talk about it. Hey everybody, my name's David.
And my name's Brian.
And this is Now Let's Be Honest, and this is part 3 in our Hesed series, where we are walking through all the instances of the word Hesed as it occurs in the books of the Bible, right? I was about to say in the book of Genesis, but we're going beyond that. We're in Genesis right now, because this is the beginning of the video, the whole series, but we're actually going, Lord willing, through all these instances. There's 247 occurrences. We covered 3 of them in the last video, but hopefully we should be covering a few more today.
Yeah.
And we don't really know how far we're going to get. We just kind of set the timer and just go for it until it's been about an hour, and then we're just like, okay, see y'all next time. Yeah. So you excited for this one?
I am.
Yeah, I think it should be a good one. This was all Brienne's idea. She was the one who kind of conceptualized this entire series, and she originally was just going to have me do it, but I was like, you know what? I would love to have you doing this alongside me, and so it kind of allows us to just kind of go back and forth a little bit. Yeah. I typically do most of the talking, but that's just kind of how it ends up going. Eventually, I'll get her to talk more. But yeah, would you open us up in a word of prayer, and then we are going to hop right back into the book of Genesis?
Yeah, absolutely. Here we go. God, we thank you so much for this life that you've given us, and we thank you for this ability to share you and your word over this platform, this media that we have. What a gift it is, and we thank you so much for that. I pray that as we go through this study, that you guide David and I's words, and that we only talk about things that you would want us to talk about. And I pray for the people that are watching, that they have their hearts open and their minds open to you and your word, that you guide them, that your spirit is present, and that you allow us to set aside all distractions and allow us to fully focus on you and your word, Lord. We thank you so much for this life, and allow us to glorify you and all that we do through this video and through the rest of our day. In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen. All right, so like I said already, we are still in the book of Genesis, and in the last video, we covered the first 3 instances of the word Hesed in this book. Those 3 instances were in Genesis chapter 19, chapter 20, and chapter 21. Mm-hmm. We mentioned how it takes 19 chapters for Hesed to be mentioned, but once it's mentioned, it starts popping up quite a bit.
Yeah.
And so what I thought we'd do real quick is just kind of briefly recap what we talked about last week, and then we'll just jump right into chapter 24, where we actually encounter the word Hesed 4 times in a single chapter.
Interesting.
And so things are really starting to ramp up here. Okay, so chapter 19, we had the whole instance of, the Sodom and Gomorrah destruction narrative.
Yeah.
And we encounter the word Hesed in verse 19, basically where Lot is talking to the angels or the messengers sent from God and just saying that they have showed him great Hesed, but he still asked them to kind of show him more Hesed.
Yeah.
Right? And basically we talked about how in these first 3 instances, it seems like Hesed is being used in a good way, but people are kind of abusing Hesed, which is kind of a very interesting way to start us off, right? It shows us right off the bat that this is a principle and something that God wants us to do, but it can very easily be abused, which is something that I think Christians, we're aware of, right?
Yeah.
I mean, whenever we're gracious to people and whenever we love people, people naturally tend to abuse those things. And so we kind of just talked about that a little bit.
And that's when we talked about the whole doormat thing, about people being able to be easily walked over and stuff, and being able to kind of find the tension and the balance. So.
Yeah, we have to figure out how to do that. Like, how do we avoid being doormats? Are we called to avoid being doormats?
Right.
That's, as Americans, we typically think, I don't want people to step all over us, but, I mean, what does God have to say? Mm-hmm. And I think that's going to be something we're wrestling through as we go throughout this series. Like, what does God want us to do there?
Right.
Genesis chapter 20, this was our first encounter between Abraham and Abimelech. And this is just whenever Abraham was talking to his wife and said, hey, whenever we go in front of Abimelech, this is how I want you to show your loyalty to me. And this is apparently what he did whenever they went anywhere. He was like, hey, whenever we go to a foreign place, you're a very beautiful woman, and the way you can show your Hesed to me is by lying to them and telling them that you're my sister. And we saw, once again, he's abusing it, right? Then we went to chapter 21, and this is after all that stuff. And we got to verse 23, and this is basically a moment whenever Abraham and Abimelech, after everything that's occurred between them, they kind of just start making kind of a little covenant between one another, just talking about how they're going to show Hesed to one another.
Yeah.
And so those were our first 3 occurrences, and now we're going to jump 3 chapters forward into Genesis chapter 24. Back in chapter 21, Isaac was born, right? The long-awaited son of Abraham. He finally showed up after a long wait. Then chapter 22, actually wait, it was chapter 20 whenever Isaac was born. Is that correct? Hold up, let me flip open my Bible here. It was either 20 or 21. I believe it was 21 when he was born. Yeah, 21's whenever he was born. Then we had another encounter between Abraham and Abimelech. That's what we talked about last time. Then chapter 22, that is the famous story with the bondage of Isaac. You know, whenever God says, hey, go sacrifice your son. And it's basically Abraham's final test of faith. Then you get to chapter 23. This is whenever Sarah dies. So Abraham's wife, Sarah, dies. And we kind of find ourselves in this situation where Abraham has been promised that he will have this entire family and nation of people. But so far, he has 2 sons, Ishmael and Isaac. And Ishmael, he was not supposed to have, really, but God still blessed him through that. But Isaac is the chosen seed. But Sarah is dead, and so Abraham is going to get remarried and have more children and stuff. But Isaac is the chosen seed, yet he does not have a spouse. And as we're going to see, Isaac's fairly old. I mean, he's in his mid-30s at this point, and he doesn't have a spouse. And so we get to Genesis chapter 24. Sarah's dead. Abraham's by himself. Isaac's by himself. And Isaac needs a wife. And so that's what we're going to be picking up with today in chapter 24. And the first few verses, I mean, I have it starting in verse 10 here. But what we have is that in the first 9 verses of Genesis chapter 24, basically Abraham is very old and he calls forth his servant. Most people think this is Eleazar. It's a servant that was mentioned earlier in Genesis. It might be the same guy where Abraham had thought prior to Isaac being born, he had said to God, hey, is Eleazar my servant going to be my heir?
Right.
And God's like, no, you're going to have an actual son. And so it could be that this is the same servant. We just don't know for sure. But Abraham calls this servant forward and says, hey, I need a wife for my son. And so I need you to go do these things in order to acquire a wife. And the servant asks different questions. And he's like, hey, what happens if this happens? And Abraham answers. And basically, Abraham's just saying, trust God. Things will play out like this.
Yeah.
All right. And so then we jump into chapter 24, verse 10. And I'm just going to read off this first slide. This story is actually going to take us through multiple different slides. But I'm just going to read this first one just to get our head in the game. And then we'll start walking through it. All right. Then the servant took 10 of his master's camels and departed with all kinds of gifts from his master at his disposal. He journeyed to the region of Aram Naharaim and the city of Nahor. He made the camels kneel down by the well outside the city. It was evening, the time when the women would go out to draw water. He prayed, O Lord, God of my master Abraham, guide me today. Be faithful to my master Abraham. Here I am standing by the spring, and the daughters of the people who live in the town are coming out to draw water. I will say to a woman, please lower your jar so I may drink. May the one whom you have chosen for your servant Isaac reply, drink, and I'll give your camels water too. In this way I will know that you have been faithful to my master. Before he had finished praying, there came Rebekah with her water jug on her shoulder. She was the daughter of Bethuel, son of Milcah. Milcah was the wife of Abraham's brother Nahor. Now, the young woman was very beautiful. She was a virgin. No man had ever been physically intimate with her. She sent down to the spring, filled her jug, and came back up. Abraham's servant ran to meet her and said, please give me a sip of water from your jug. Drink, my lord, she replied, and quickly lowering her jug to her hands, she gave him a drink. When she had done so, she said, I'll draw water for your camels too, until they have drunk as much as they want. She quickly emptied her jug into the watering trough and ran back to the well to draw more water until she had drawn enough for all his camels. Silently, the man watched her with interest to determine if the Lord had made his journey successful or not. Okay, what do you think about that story?
This is definitely a much more positive occurrence of the word Hesed. It's in a more positive context, so that's kind of cool. And I think it also shows a lot of kind of like the servant's faith, because as he's going on this journey, you can tell just by him saying, that God's going to be faithful to his master Abraham. Like, he's not out there to get credit for himself. And then you also see that he recognizes that it's God that's going to place this woman there for him to be able to find, and that it's not something that necessarily he is doing on his own.
Yeah.
So I guess that kind of shows a little bit of kind of the servant's faith and where his mind is at in this, and we see that he's thinking on the right track.
Yeah. I think, to me, the thing that stands out in this passage, if we're just talking about like the development of the concept of Hesed in the Bible, here we see that the covenant of God is dependent on Hesed. Right? This is why people might call it covenantal love or something like that. Because God has made this promise to Abraham, and he said, I am going to give you a family that is going to become a nation. You're going to be the father of many nations, right? That's what Abraham means, father of a multitude. And he says, I'm going to do these things for you, and through you, the world's going to be blessed. And so now we find ourselves at this pivot moment where Isaac has been born, but he doesn't have a wife. And if you don't have a wife, how are you going to have kids?
Right.
And so the servant really is placing his faith in God's Hesed here, right? So we have him at the beginning. He takes 10 of his master's camels, departs with all kinds of gifts from his master at his disposal, right? So he leaves the land, and he's going back to Abraham's homeland where he came from because he's trying to find a relative from that area rather than a person from the land of Canaan. It needs to be somebody from Abraham's own household.
Right.
And he's going there ready to get a spouse. He journeys to the region of Aram Naharaim, into the city of Nahor being Abraham's brother. He made the camels kneel down by the well outside the city. It was evening, the time when the women would go out to draw water, right? So we see this throughout the Bible. There's a certain time whenever women would go out to draw water. It would usually be early in the morning or late in the evening, usually in the cool of the day. Nobody would really want to go out during the middle of the day because it's too hot, and this is actually pretty laborious work. And women typically didn't want to be super tan, and so you would try to do it, whenever there wasn't a lot of sun out.
Yeah.
And that's why it's so significant with the woman at the well story, whenever she's showing up at the well in the middle of the day. Because you're like, this is not when women would do this.
Yeah.
But, so it's evening time. Obviously this was not a one-day journey for this guy. He has traveled a great distance. He's been probably traveling for weeks, if not months. But it's finally evening time. He gets there, and the women are coming out to draw water. And so he prays. Right? And this, like you were mentioning, this is a pretty faithful guy. He immediately turns to God. And really this whole, I've actually used this chapter many times to just demonstrate principles of good servitude. Whenever I'm just like talking to people about like, what's it mean to be a disciple of Christ? Well, you kind of want to be a disciple of Christ in the same way this guy is a servant to Abraham, because he's actually just a really good, faithful servant the whole way through. And so right here, he prays to God. Rather than just trusting his own judgment here, he turns and says, Yahweh, God of my master Abraham, guide me today. So he's asking to be in God's will. And then he says, be faithful. But in reality, that's Hesed, right? He's saying, show me Hesed. Or show Hesed to my master Abraham. It's not even show me Hesed. It's show Hesed to Abraham. And so you're saying, well, what exactly is Hesed here? Right? Like, what exactly is he asking of God? Well, he's going to explain that, right? So if you're wanting to define what Hesed is, you have to look to what he says afterwards, right? Show Hesed to Abraham. Well, how is he going to do that? Here I am standing by the spring, and the daughters of the people who live in the town are coming out to draw water. So he sees them. Like, literally, this is like a moment where, this entire journey happened, and it's just summarized by saying he left and he arrived. That was like multiple weeks, if not months. Now, everything slows down, and in this moment, as he sees the women walking out, he mutters this prayer, right? So everything just like slows down. The women are coming out to draw water. I will say to a young woman, please lower your jar so I may drink. May the one whom you have chosen for your servant Isaac reply, drink, and I'll water your camels too. In this way, I'll know that you have been faithful. You have shown Hesed to my master, right? So he explicitly states what his view of Hesed is, right? Show my master Abraham Hesed. How? By doing this. Then I'll know that you have shown my master Hesed. So you see how it's bookended, right? You have Hesed, in between he explains what it is. So according to the servant, what do you think that he is kind of defining as Hesed here?
I would think it would be to fulfill what Abraham originally called him to go and do. So to find a wife for his son, so that way they can continue the line.
Yeah.
Because that's what Abraham specifically asked him to. That's the last thing that they conversated about before he left.
Yeah. And so it specifically ties into the covenant, right? You have promised my master Abraham a family. And so show Hesed by giving him a family, right? And so it really seems to tie into that exact concept. That's why people translate it as covenantal love. That's why right here it's translated as faithfulness, right? Are you going to be faithful to do what you promised, right? That really is a big question throughout the whole book of Genesis. It's like, how is God going to accomplish that which he has promised? Because he shows up, and especially in the early chapters of Genesis, I'm thinking chapters like 1 through 17, right? All of those chapters, God is just showering promise upon promise upon all these people, right? Whether it be upon Cain, upon Noah, upon Abraham, all these different people are receiving these promises from God. And really the question of Genesis is like, how is God going to fulfill all this?
Right.
Because it seems like it's almost too good to be true. And a lot of it just seems so difficult. I mean, he turns to Abraham, whose wife is barren, and says, I'm going to give you a nation. And it's like, you literally could have picked anybody else. Like just somebody with a non-barren wife.
Right.
But he goes out of his way and he picks a person with a barren wife who's already in his old age. And so like God's constantly doing these things that is basically putting himself in an impossible situation. And so the question of Genesis is, how will God be faithful? So really you could say, how will God show his Hesed? Right? And that's what the servant is wrestling through right here. Okay, God, here I am. You have given me successful voyage. You've given me a successful travel all the way here. And now I need my camels watered, and I could do this myself, but I'm going to ask you to supernaturally provide. It's actually a pretty bold thing, right? Because, I mean, if we were to pray this right now, we would have no reason to expect that God would actually do this, right? This is like, God, if I'm supposed to have $1 million, make it rain bunnies. You know, it's like one of those things where it's like, wait, what? Like, people sometimes pray that way, and I think they probably get it from something like this. But if you read the previous verses, Abraham kind of suggested to the servant that God would answer him in such a way, right? He's like, God will provide for you. Just ask of him what you need. And so here the servant is, and he asks for a pretty like a supernatural demonstration. He's like, okay, God, here's these women coming. And just to make this a quick trip to where I can just get this woman as quickly as possible, I'm going to do this highly specific thing. And I need the women, like the woman who you've chosen, I need her to reply in a highly specific manner. Right? So when I ask her, I need water, let her say, not only will I give you water, I will water the camels as well. And you see how even her response ties into the concept of Hesed. Right? Because
giving more than what he asked for.
Exactly. And it goes back to Michael Card's definition of, receiving everything whenever you have the right to expect nothing. Right? So basically, he's saying, God, I have no right to expect anything from you, but you will give everything to me and to my master Abraham by causing a woman to show Hesed, right? So show Hesed to me by allowing a woman to show Hesed, right? So you see how these all kind of tie together. The faithfulness of God will be demonstrated through the faithfulness of Isaac's wife. And so you'll see it kind of, the way that he'll know that he has found the proper wife for Isaac is because the woman will demonstrate the character of God to him. Right? Because this is how God functions. God is a God who says, not only will I give you this, I'll give you even more. And so whenever a woman shows up and does that, that will be the sign that God has picked that woman, because she is already demonstrating that she is a worthwhile wife for the chosen seed who is supposed to embody the character of God.
I was about to say, then that would be important for her to be in the line, because if she has that good character, that's what they're going to want through the promised seed.
So it's not enough to simply be from the family or the household of Abraham. You need to also have the character befitting of the chosen seed, right? So he's not just coming here being like, eeny, meeny, miny, mo, pick that person.
The first one he sees.
No, it's like, well, ironically, it is going to be the first one he sees. But that's not how he's doing it, right? That's just because of the providence of God. In this moment, he's just saying, okay, God, I want to make sure that I find a woman of good character. It's not about her looks. It's not about, just how charming she is. It's about her character. Will she demonstrate the Hesed that reflects God's own Hesed? Right? And so you kind of have this bookended thing here to where Hesed is all about fulfilling the promise of God. Like, God, you will show this to me by proving that you are going to do what you said you would do.
Yeah.
Like, supernaturally show me the wife for my master's servant. And therefore you will show the Hesed to the master. I just think it's very interesting that he continually says, you'll show it to my master.
Right, not to him.
Yeah, not to him. Because really God is showing it to him as well, but that's where it really seems like particularly tied to the covenant in this usage. Because it's all about the promise that God made to Abraham. Like, that's what the servant has in mind.
Yeah.
If he said, you'll show Hesed to me, then it would be more like the idea of the servant just being lazy, and he just wants this to be a quick trip. Right? He's like, you'll show me Hesed by making it to where the first person I see does this. But that's not what he's doing. It's all about God fulfilling his promise to Abraham, and so we see that the servant really is being kind of selfless in this regard. It's not that he just wants to, like... Because what we're going to see as we go further into this chapter is that the servant is going to do, like, a quick turnover. Like, hey, get up and let's go back now.
Right.
But it's not because he's lazy, and it's not because he's just trying to rush the job. It's because he's faithful.
Yeah.
And so I think it's... Yeah, and so I think it's actually significant that it's the Hesed being shown to Abraham, not just to him.
Yeah.
And so, to move on, in fulfillment of this, before he had finished praying, there came Rebekah with her water jug on her shoulder. I love this. Like, it's literally like he's still muttering the prayer. Yeah. And I think we talked about this because we've been going through Genesis with our group, and we talked about how interesting it is that God begins to fulfill this thing even before he finished the prayer, which also suggests, like, you know, God was fulfilling it before he even prayed
already
it,
in motion.
right? Like, like Rebekah shows up with the water jug before he finishes praying, but that means that Rebekah had to leave her house with the water jug before he even started praying. Right? Like, he probably already saw Rebekah in the distance. And so it's weird how, like, you know, God fulfilled all of this. Yeah. Even before he started praying, but it happened according to this because of the prayer. So it's just something interesting about prayer. She was the daughter of Bethuel, son of Milcah. Milcah was the wife of Abraham's brother Nahor, so it's just explaining, like, the family relations there, which is significant to Abraham. Now, the young woman was very beautiful. She was a virgin. No man had ever been physically intimate with her. So it's restated multiple times because it's highlighting her character. It's highlighting the type of person she is. Ultimately, she is desirable from a human perspective, from like a worldly perspective, right? She's good looking and she seems like she has pretty good character. This is the type of person you'd want to be with. But that is not the deciding factor, right? Even though she's a virgin, even though she's beautiful, that's not going to be the deciding factor for Abraham's servant. She went down to the spring, filled her jug, and came back up. Abraham's servant ran to meet her and said, "Please give me a sip of water from your jug." This is really cool because this is the first person he's apparently talked to. Right. "Please give me a sip of water from your jug." "Drink, my lord," she replied, and quickly lowering her jug into her hands, she gave him a drink. When she had done so, she said, "I'll draw water for your camels too, until they have drunk as much as they want." This is the definition of Hesed. Yeah. Because if you just think about how much work this would take, like, I don't know the exact, like, how much a camel can hold, but they can hold quite a bit of water. And it says that, like, she's not just saying, "I'll draw water for your camels," period. It's until they've drunk as much as they want. They can drink a whole lot of water. They can store up a whole lot of water. It's already late at night, and this woman is immediately committing to probably a few hours more work. Like, she just came to get water for her family, but now she's watering this dude and watering all 10 of his camels. Yeah. Like, that's a lot of camels, right? There's 10 camels. She's watering them as much as they want. It's at least 10 trips, but probably well more than 10 trips. She is really just, like, this is just a remarkable act of graciousness. Yeah. Especially for a stranger, right? All he did, like, he didn't ask for this either.
Yeah. I was about to say she's never met him before.
Yeah. This is a random guy from thousands of miles away who just comes up and is like, "Hey, I'd like a sip of water." And she's like, "Not only will I give you a full, like, you know, like a jug of water, I will also, like, fill your camels until they want no more." It's like, wow. Like, this is a remarkable woman. Like, not only is she beautiful, not only is she a virgin, she is the embodiment of the character of God. At least at this point in the story. Later on, she won't be quite as amazing. I mean, in this chapter, she's amazing. Later on in the story of Genesis, not so much. Yeah. But yeah, so this is just a remarkable response here. And it is literally the definition of Hesed. But in doing so, like, it's really cool how this kind of all ties together here. Because she is going above and beyond what he even asked of God, right? Because he just said, "Drink and I'll water your camels too." He didn't specify how much. Yeah. She says, "I'm going to go above and beyond and, like, water them until they want no more." But this is also God going above and beyond as well, because the servant seems to have expected that he'd have to ask a few different people. He's like, "Well, just, you know, like, let the one who responds this way be the girl.
Mm-hmm.
But then it's literally the first girl he goes up to.
Right.
And so God is showing Hesed.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I meant at the very beginning of this video, in my little blurb before the opening, now let's be honest thing rolled around. I said that this is the first time that we've actually seen Hesed being used in relationship between man and God. Right? Because we actually see God fulfilling his Hesed right here. And we already talked about it last week.
Right.
But here, it was a specific request.
Direct.
Show your Hesed to Abraham by doing this. And God is doing that. So God is being faithful. She quickly emptied her jug into the watering trough and ran back to the well to draw more water until she had drawn enough for all the camels. Like, do you see also the words being used there? She ran back.
Yeah.
Right? It's not just like slowly she's like, oh man, I can't believe.
Like it's a burden. It's something that she's wanting to do.
No, she's like eager to do this. Like she is a willing servant here. Silently, the man watched her with interest to determine if the Lord had made his journey successful or not. This kind of, it kind of cracks me up because obviously I think that this dude very early on recognized that this was successful. But you can just imagine him like just watching.
Her just running back and forth.
Yeah.
And just like observing from the distance. Like, is this really happening? Like the first woman I talked to?
Yeah, he's probably shocked.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, like that's probably more like whenever it says to determine if the Lord had made his journey successful or not, I think it's probably more he's doing that out of surprise, not as in like
actually contemplating it.
Well, yeah, because it's very obvious.
Right.
Like it's almost like he's looking like, well, that was too easy. Like, did I not pray specific enough? Like, is everybody here that generous?
Yeah.
Like he's more just looking like, what? Like how,
what is going on?
Like who is this woman and how is this working? Yeah. So I think that's why he's more surprised. And so we move on. Verse 22. After the camels had finished drinking, the man took out a gold nose ring, weighing a beka, and 2 gold wrist bracelets, weighing 10 shekels, and gave them to her. Whose daughter are you? He asked. Tell me, is there room in your father's house for us to spend the night? She said to him, I am the daughter of Bethuel, the son of Milcah, whom Milcah bore to Nahor. We have plenty of straw and feed, she added, and room for you to spend the night. The man bowed his head and worshipped the Lord, saying, Praise be the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who has not abandoned his faithful love for my master. I'm supposed to have part of that in purple, but I messed up. So every time you see the word truth or emet, I'm going to highlight that in purple. I just messed up here. The Lord has led me to the house of my master's relatives. The young woman ran and told her mother's household all about these things. Now Rebekah had a brother named Laban. Laban rushed out to meet the man at the spring. When he saw the bracelets on his sister's wrist and the nose ring and heard his sister Rebekah say, This is what the man said to me, he went out to meet the man. There he was, standing by the camels near the spring. Laban said to him, Come, you are blessed by the Lord. Why are you standing out here when I have prepared the house and a place for the camels? So Abraham's servant went to the house and unloaded the camels. Straw and feed were given to the camels, and water was provided so that he and the men who were with him could wash their feet. When the food was served, he said, I will not eat until I have said what I want to say. Tell us, Laban said. All right, so here we have a little progression of the story. Yep. What do you think about this part?
So I think the use of Hesed here is cool because it paints the servant again in a really good light. Because, again, it's used in prayer. And that's his first reaction after actually getting, a conversation between him and the woman, that he goes straight to prayer again, which is really cool. Yeah.
I mean, we see how the response here, it almost reads like in the Psalms. Whenever David, always says, praise the Lord for his Hesed.
Yeah.
Which we'll see whenever we eventually get there in a million years.
Yeah.
But yeah, what I really like about this is that, to go off your point about how the servant is a very faithful guy, typically whenever God fulfills whenever he answers one of our prayers, we typically just forget. Typically we're like, God, please help me in this situation. And then he helps us. And then we're like, man, I'm so glad I got myself out of that situation.
Yeah, we give credit to ourselves.
Yeah, we give credit to ourselves. Whereas this guy immediately gives credit to God. And so let's see how this fulfilled, right? How this was fulfilled. After the camels had finished drinking, the man took out a gold nose ring weighing a beka and 2 gold wrist bracelets weighing 10 shekels and gave them to her. So first and foremost, this is kind of just payment for what she did, right? I mean, she has shown Hesed to him, and she was not asking for anything in return, so he shows it to her.
Yeah.
Do you see this concept? I mean, obviously Hesed is not mentioned here, but we saw it before. We're seeing it again in a few verses. The theme is still there.
Yeah.
And so we see this idea that Hesed is contagious, right? So God shows Hesed to Abraham through Rebecca showing Hesed to the servant, and because she showed Hesed to the servant, he's showing Hesed to her by giving her something she didn't ask for.
Yeah.
But this is also kind of a down payment because he's kind of thinking this is going to be the wife, right? And so all of this kind of just flows together where it's like Hesed is just outpouring from all different directions. He says to her, "Whose daughter are you?" And he says, "Tell me, is there room in your father's house for us to spend the night?" So he asks her two questions. Who are your relatives, and is there room for us to spend the night? Us being him, his fellow servants who are with him, and all the animals they have with him, right? Yeah. And so those two questions are what he asks, and she answers both. She said to him, "I am the daughter of Bethuel, the son of Milcah, who Milcah bore to Nahor." And he's so like, immediately, yes. Like, really, this was just, like, the thing that was kind of just sealing the deal.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, he was looking at this girl being like, this has got to be the one. I mean,
right.
literally, before I even finished praying. Like, I didn't even get to finish the prayer, and God fulfilled it. And so, really, the only thing is, like, okay, do you meet the criteria? This is kind of like whenever you get to the Gospels and you meet Jesus for the first time. Like, Jesus is doing all the messianic stuff, but you've got to ask yourself, like, does he meet the criteria? And so that's why you have, like, the Gospel of Matthew starting out with, like, oh, let's start with his genealogy. Let's start by talking about John the Baptist.
Yeah.
You know, like, basically doing all these things to authenticate Jesus.
Right.
That's kind of what this guy's doing. He's like, okay, you're doing all the things that the wife of Isaac, according to my prayer, is supposed to do to fulfill God's Hesed to Abraham. But if you aren't from the family of Abraham, it doesn't matter, right? Like, you need to be from that. And she's like, I am.
Yeah.
Like, I am actually descended from Nahor. Oh, Abraham's brother. Sweet. Well, this works out really well.
Yeah. And that shows that the servant is specifically wanting to please God in the covenant he has with Abraham. Because if he was just wanting to, like, please Abraham, like, he has a woman in his hand, he could just take her and leave.
Who has amazing character.
Exactly. Yeah. But if he's wanting to please God in the covenant that he has given, then he's wanting to make sure that he's crossing all of his T's and dotting all of his I's and making sure it is the right woman before he takes her.
Yeah, because no matter what, this woman is a great catch.
Right.
I mean, she's beautiful, she's a virgin, and she's literally willing to just dedicate hours to serving a stranger.
Yeah.
I mean, this is an amazing woman, but he still wants to clarify, okay, do you meet the criteria? But then he had also asked her, is there room in the father's house to spend the night? So really, this is kind of a test of hospitality, but also, I mean, he needs a place to stay.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And he also needs to talk to her family.
Right.
And she says, we have plenty of straw and feed. So she's like, we can definitely provide for you and your animals. But if you just think about that, like, he didn't ask about being fed. He just said, is there a place to stay? And she's like, we have plenty to provide for you. So she continues to give. And it seems to imply that her family was relatively gracious as well.
Yeah.
Because she's suggesting that, I mean, typically you would think she would have to run back. I imagine she's pretty young here, right?
Right.
I mean, I imagine she's probably an early teenager. Like, probably maybe 13 or 14. Right. Isaac's going to be significantly older, but she's probably relatively young here.
Right.
You would think she would have to run home and be like, hey, can we, like, have him over? But, like, it's just understood. She's like, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, you
it's
can.
Like what her family does.
Yeah, this is what we do. We have plenty of straw and feed, and room for you to spend the night. So yeah,
which comes
absolutely.
second, which is interesting because that's what he asked for. Is there a place to spend the night? But that comes second to her providing for him first.
Yeah, which is the Hesed aspect, right? I mean, it's like, I'll answer your question, but before, let me give you a greater gift than that. The man bowed his head and worshipped the Lord, because in this response, he has received the answer. He's like, yes, this is absolutely the woman.
Right.
And so his response is not to be like, okay, I'll go with you. First, he must bow down and worship God. So he bows down, he worships the Lord, saying, praise be the Lord, the God of my master Abraham. He always calls him the God of my master Abraham, because we don't know where the servant's from. We don't know exactly how he came to know Abraham. We don't know where he came from or anything. If he is the servant from earlier, I believe it. Yeah, if he is Eleazar, I believe that is specified. Let me go look real quick. It's in chapter 15. Eleazar to Damascus, right? So he's actually from Damascus, which is up north. And so if it is the same servant, we know that he's not from the same land as Abraham, and so maybe Abraham just acquired him at some point. But he calls Yahweh the God of his master Abraham, because that is how he came to know Yahweh, right? So it's not saying that it isn't his God, it's just that it was Abraham's God first. And so that's why I would also say that, like, our God is the God of Abraham. It's not because he's not my God. It's just because that's through whom we came to know him.
Right.
So praised be the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who has not abandoned his Hesed and Emet for my master, right? So this is one of those places where the New English Translation, which is what we're using, I don't really like how they translate this because they kind of just take these two words and lump them together. And they make it faithful love. So where faithful, I imagine, would be the emet part of things, right? So truth.
Yeah.
And then love would be the Hesed part of things. But that kind of bothers me because they were translating Hesed before as faithful, right? And so you really kind of miss out on both of these.
Yeah.
But really what he says here is, who has not abandoned his Hesed and emet, his Hesed and his truth. So like to go to the whole, John chapter 1 verse 14 thing, grace and truth. Or whenever we get to Exodus 34, we're going to see Hesed and truth. This is our first occurrence of these two words occurring side by side, and it's definitely not going to be the last. We're going to see these side by side a lot here. So what do you think about those being kind of side by side in this case, and why do you think that he might kind of implement both of these? Like it would make sense for him to just say, who has not abandoned his Hesed.
Yeah.
Because he's already said Hesed before.
Right.
Right? He says, show us Hesed. But he also includes truth here. So what do you think about that?
It's almost like he's recognized that he asked for one thing, and he was given that plus more. So it was almost like God showed us Hesed plus more. So it's like he's trying to define it in even more than what Hesed is. So he's adding something more, like God gave me this plus this type of thing. So it's both of the terms together.
Yeah, it seems like it's building off of the idea that, Hesed is, it's whenever you receive that which you had no right to expect. But at the same time, I think that there is an element of expectation to this, right? So when it comes to truth or faithfulness, which really you can translate emet both ways. It could be either truth or faithfulness. There is an element of expectation to that, right? God did say that I will give you a family. I will make you a nation. And therefore Isaac needed to have a wife. And so I would think that maybe the truth aspect of things is God was faithful to that. He was speaking truly when he said that. Yeah. And so we had the right to expect that Isaac would have a wife. But the way by which that wife was provided was totally unexpected, and it was beyond what we could have ever asked for, right? And so you really have both of these things. It's almost like, in a way, Hesed and Emet, they're almost opposed to each other, but not in they're opposites and they're too different. It's almost like they're two sides of the same thing. God has given them what they had the right to expect because of his promise, but the promise itself flowed from something they had no right to expect, right? So once he made the promise to Abraham, therefore they had the right to expect it, but he kept giving and giving and giving more. But in doing so, he was fulfilling his promise to Abraham all the way. And so I think they kind of flow hand in hand here. And I really like he says, you have not abandoned your Hesed and Emet. Which, just kind of from a literary perspective here, that implies to us that this is not our first occurrence of Hesed and Emet.
Right.
It is just our first time where it's explicitly been called that.
Right.
Because in order for somebody to not abandon something, that means that they had to have had it prior to that moment. Right? And so really, just because of this one statement, that means that Hesed and Emet from God to Abraham has been present for a good amount of time, right? In order for God to have abandoned it, he would have had to have had it. And so it's been there, and the servant is saying, you haven't abandoned it. And so this really is kind of encouraging you to go look into the previous chapters. I would say go back as far as Genesis 12, whenever God first appears to Abraham, at the time named Abram, and probably just look and figure out, okay, what exactly is Hesed and Emet? What really is that, and how is God demonstrating that to Abraham? And I would say it's primarily through the covenant. Yeah. Right? God says, I will provide for you, I will bless you, and through you the world will be blessed. And we see that actually happening throughout all the subsequent chapters. Yeah. And so it's really the same instance here whenever the servant is looking and he's like, wow, you are really doing what you said you would do.
I would say even the birth of Isaac, that would be a really big thing, because he's saying that you're going to have this promised seed and it's going to be through you, but the way that it happens is a way they wouldn't expect.
Yeah.
So that would be an occurrence of that.
Well, yeah, because Abraham tried doing it the way he would expect.
Yeah, with
right?
The
because in the culture at that time period, they could just have children by proxy, and so he just has a kid with his wife's maidservant, names him Ishmael, and for 13 years kind of raised him as the promised seed.
Right.
And then God shows up and is like, no,
that's not it.
No, I'm going to give you a child through your wife.
Yeah.
And so it is kind of the whole Hesed and Emet, right?
Yeah.
Like God made this promise, and really, I guess in a way, kind of to go back to what I had said earlier about how Genesis is all about wrestling through how will God fulfill his promises.
Yeah.
It kind of brings those two concepts together, right?
Right.
How will God do it? Will he do it the way we expect him to do it? Or will he do it in the way that we don't expect it? Either way, he is showing both Hesed and Emet. Because really, the Emet part, the truth, is just showing that he will fulfill it, right? Without regard to expectation, right? He fulfilled it. The Hesed part is the part that defies expectation. Like he's gone above and beyond. He's been extra gracious. And so the servant says, "Praise be the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who has not abandoned his Hesed and Emet for my master. The Lord has led me to the house of my master's relatives." So he's just rejoicing. He's like, wow, like this literally worked out so perfectly. I made this journey and I thought I was going to be here for a long time searching. And literally the first woman I talked to, it's just her.
Yeah.
Like this is crazy.
Yeah.
It really defies expectation. The young woman ran and told her mother's household all about these things. I think it's interesting it says mother's household there, but yeah. Now Rebekah had a brother named Laban. Laban rushed out to meet the man at the spring. Maybe actually it's probably because I think that the father is dead at this point. That I could be wrong there, but I believe that the fathers might be dead. Maybe not. I mean, I don't know. It's been a while since I've read this particular chapter, and so we'll figure that out. But it's just weird to me that it says mother's household.
Right.
Now Rebekah had a brother named Laban. That's put like parenthetical just to kind of explain to us this. Laban's going to be a key figure in our story going forward.
Yep.
I don't know. We're not going to talk about him a whole lot in this, but in Genesis he's significant.
Yeah.
Laban rushed out to meet the man at the spring. When he saw the bracelets on his sister's wrist and the nose ring and heard his sister Rebekah say, "This is what the man said to me," he went out to meet the man. This is just a fun thing about Laban to me, because Laban seems very enthusiastic here. And in this moment, it's innocent enough. But from what we're going to see about Laban later on in Genesis, he seems like a very greedy individual. Yeah. And so once you read the later chapters of Genesis, it kind of makes you reread these chapters in a more...
different context.
Yeah, different context. Because right here, it just seems like Laban's excited to see somebody that, is from Abraham's household. But whenever you know a little bit more about Laban's character, it's interesting that it says, when he saw the bracelets on his sister's wrists and the nose ring, and heard his sister Rebekah say, "This is what the man said to me." It seems like Laban's more focused on the material gain that they could get from this guy. Right. But I don't think you're supposed to necessarily read that into it right now. It's just once you've read the rest of Genesis, you're like, interesting. There he was, standing by the camels near the spring. Laban said to him, so the servant had just been kind of waiting there the whole time. Laban said to him, "Come, you who are blessed by Yahweh. Why are you standing out here when I have prepared the house and a place for the camels?" And so apparently he just immediately set this all up. So we do see this graciousness being shown. Laban actually comes across in a very positive light. And so once again, this suggests to me that the father would be dead because Laban seems to be the man of the house.
Standing in,
So Abraham's servant went to the house and unloaded the camels. Straw and feed were given to the camels, and water was provided so that he and the men who were with him could wash their feet. This is something that we forget sometimes, but there were other men with the servant. It wasn't just him. They're opening their house to all of them. When food was served, he said, "I will not eat until I have said what I want to say." "Tell us," Laban said. And so here's once again just a place where doesn't really go into our discussion of Hesed, but it shows that this servant is just a great, great dude. Like, it seems almost kind of rude to say what he's saying here. Because first off, think about it. It's already late at night. It was evening whenever she started serving the guy.
Right.
And so hours have probably passed at this point. She had to run back home. They had to make accommodations. He's finally there. It's probably late into the night. And they're just wanting to eat. And he says, "I need to talk to you before I eat." And it seems kind of like a almost rude thing to say. Whenever these people have invited you into your household, you're supposed to kind of just welcome their hospitality.
Right.
And usually, we saw this in Genesis chapter 18. Usually you would serve the meal and then discuss afterwards. But in Genesis 24 here, the servant says, "No, I need to talk first. We need to talk business, then we can eat." And that's really just because he wants to fulfill Abraham's request. He's a really good servant. And Laban says, "Tell us." So we move on, and we're going to skip a little bit so that we don't have to read this whole thing. Genesis 24 is a very long chapter. But in verses 34 to 44, Abraham's servant basically just recounts the whole story. And it's actually repeated pretty in depth.
It is.
And we've talked about this in our own personal study stuff, but it seems like it's mainly repeated because the servant the narrator of Genesis really wants to highlight the Hesed of God, right? He's really wanting to highlight how out of the way God went, and how really remarkable story this is. And so it's not just being repeated for repetition's sake, it's because there's an emphasis being drawn there. And so finally, picking up in verse 45, we read, "Before I finished praying in my heart, along came Rebekah with her water jug on her shoulder." So he's still recounting the story. "She went down to the spring and drew water. So I said to her, 'Please give me a drink.' She quickly lowered her jug from her shoulder and said, 'Drink, and I'll give your camels water too.' So I drank, and she also gave the camels water. Then I asked her, 'Whose daughter are you?' She replied, 'The daughter of Bethuel, the son of Nahor, whom Milcah bore to Nahor.' I put the ring in her nose and the bracelets on her wrists. Then I bowed down and worshipped the Lord. I praised the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who had led me on the right path to find the granddaughter of my master's brother for his son." That's a very long, complicated. It's like
going through the family tree.
But apparently this servant just knows how to say it.
Yeah.
"Now, if you will show faithful love, Hesed and Emet to my master, tell me. But if not, tell me as well, so that I may go on my way." Then Laban and Bethuel replied, "This is the Lord's doing. Our wishes are of no concern. Rebekah stands here before you. Take her and go, that she may become the wife of your master's son, just as the Lord has decided." So, interesting progression there.
Yeah.
We see Hesed and Emet again, but now it's not directed at God. It's directed at Laban and the rest of the family. What do you think about that?
Well, I guess it's kind of the same concept how we saw it before the Emet. That is, there is truth behind the statement, as in, like, she follows the family line and she fits all of the criteria. But now he's almost, like asking a blessing from their family. He can't just like take the one. Well, I mean, I guess he could, but that's not the way he's going to do it. We've seen from his character that's not the way he's going to do it.
Yeah.
So he's asking for a blessing from them to let him have the woman to take him back to Abraham and Isaac. And they don't necessarily have to say yes to this situation. Like they're not, required to say yes. This is like he's asking for it, so that would be the Hesed part of it.
Yeah.
Them being gracious and giving the daughter away in order to go back to Abraham and Isaac. So.
Yeah. And I think there's also this other aspect of, given the fact that he literally just recounted all of the details of the story, and they know that God definitely gave his seal of approval here, they know that God was definitely showing Hesed and Emet here.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so whenever he turns it back to them, in a way, I wouldn't be surprised if the faithful love of God, as it's translated here, now becomes their duty. Does that make sense?
Right.
Right? It's like, okay, I'm trying to think of like a modern example. Like, if you know with certainty that God has told you to be gracious to somebody, which he has told us to do, but I'm not thinking like some specific example. Like,
right.
Say that there was like this homeless guy who walked up and he was asking for like $20, and I prayed and I was like, "God, I don't have $20, but if a flash of green lightning struck the ground 2 feet away from me at this moment, then we'll know that Brienne has to give that homeless guy $20, right?"
Yeah.
This is just a terrible hypothetical scenario because I'm not good at thinking of these things on the spot.
Yeah.
But then I said that, and then immediately at that moment, green lightning struck. I was trying to remember my own scenario. Like green lightning struck the ground 2 feet away from me.
Yeah.
I'd be like, "Well, crud." And then I go tell you that story. Then it no longer becomes God's Hesed and Emet. It's now your obligation as well.
Right.
Because it's like, okay, you can say no, but the story I told you clearly demonstrates that God wants you to do this.
Right, yeah.
So you should probably do it. And so it seems like even though this is being directed at Laban and them, it's almost by proxy, right? Like God has demonstrated this Hesed and Emet to me and to my master, but now that becomes yours to demonstrate.
Right.
So the grace shown by God becomes the grace shown by God's people, which is kind of a cool concept because that's exactly what this whole Hesed discussion is about, right? I mean, God is the God of Hesed, and he calls us to demonstrate that same thing. And so I just think that's kind of an interesting idea there. But at the very least, kind of like you were saying, both of these same concepts do apply just to them at face value. He says, now, if you will show Hesed and emet to my master, tell me. Right? So if you will give my master what he has no right to expect, but you will be faithful to him as his kin, as his blood, tell me right now. But if not, tell me as well so I may go on my way. I would be more than happy to accept your hospitality, and I am really hungry and ready to eat this food. But if we're not actually going to do anything of this, I probably just need to get up and go on my way because I'm determined to find a wife for my master's son. And so we just see that this servant is an absolutely great guy. In all of this, literally everything he's doing all revolves around Hesed, right? Literally all of it. He's like, okay, my mission is a mission to demonstrate God's Hesed, right? God's going to show it, you're going to show it, and by all of this, God's Hesed will be demonstrated, and literally Isaac's wife will be produced by Hesed.
And in like that line alone, when it says, but if not, tell me as well so that I may go on my way, that shows that if Laban gives the daughter to him, that the servant isn't forcing him to, which validates the fact that it is Hesed and Emet is the reason that he's giving the daughter to him, not because the servant is like, you need to do this, like forcing him to. He's willingly giving the daughter. Yeah,
well, it's not an abuse of it. Like, in contrast, in the previous week, like last week, whenever we talked about Abraham talking to Sarah, he said, you'll show your Hesed to me by doing this.
Right.
But he didn't really give her an option. Right? It seems like you need to do this. Like, if not, I'm going to die. Like, he didn't really give her an out to where she could be like, I think there's a better solution. Right? He was kind of abusing that and saying, like, you need to be gracious to me by doing this. Whereas the servant's like, no hard feelings. Like, you have an option here. I think I've made a good case that God wants you to. But if you don't want to, that's fine. I'll get out of here because I do have a job for my master, and I'm determined to get that done. And so, really, it isn't an abuse of Hesed, but it is still a request, right? Like, I would like you to do this for me, but if not, no worries. I'll move on my way. And so, it really is kind of cool there. But I like how the word Hesed showing up here at the climactic moments of all of these things, right? It's at the climactic moment of his prayer, and it like bookends it, and then it's at this climactic moment when they're deciding like who will Isaac's wife be.
It shows that everything hinges upon it.
Then Laban and Bethuel replied, "This is the Lord's doing," which that's the only rational response. It is the Lord's doing. Our wishes are of no concern, which is also a good response, right? That's something that we need to recognize, right? A lot of times nowadays we're like, oh, I know what God wants, but this is what I want. No, this is the right response. What the Lord does becomes the primary concern, and anything else no longer matters. And they're like, okay, God wants this, our wishes don't matter. Which might actually kind of imply that they don't want her to go. Right? Which is what he kind of picks up on later in the story, but we're not going to go into that part because it goes beyond the whole Hesed discussion. But they're like, our wishes are of no concern. So probably they did not want her to go. They probably wanted her sticking around. But they're like, we can't deny what God wants here. Rebecca stands here before you. Take her and go so that she may become the wife of your master's son, just as the Lord has decided. So they see that Hesed no longer becomes a choice, right? God has demonstrated his Hesed, and in him demonstrating his Hesed and truth, we have no choice but to respond the same way. If God is demonstrating Hesed and truth to your master Abraham, then we have no choice but to do the same thing. This is a good application point for us, right? If God is gracious to others, we should be gracious to others. If God is gracious to us, we should be gracious to others. That's just the constant call of the entire Bible. And so there's our discussion of Hesed in Genesis chapter 24. We haven't quite reached the hour mark yet. And so I think we might be able to sneak in one more.
I think we can.
Right? And so now we're going to jump forward to Genesis chapter 32. And there's a lot of stuff that happens in between 24 and 32, right? There are 8 chapters. And just to breeze through it very quickly, we have Isaac. He marries Rebecca, right? And it says that he's comforted in light of his mother's recent death. He's comforted and he marries her and everything's good. They have 2 kids, Jacob and Esau. Esau is the elder son, Jacob is the younger son, and therefore Esau is supposed to be the one in line for both the blessing and the birthright. But even at their birth, there's this prophecy given that the older shall serve the younger, and so we kind of learned very early on that Jacob's going to be the one that kind of gets all this stuff, and sure enough, that's what happened. Jacob is basically, if I always compare Jacob and Esau to Thor and Loki, but Esau is the Thor figure, and Jacob's the Loki figure, where Esau is just kind of this big meathead, kind of a goof a little bit.
Yeah.
A big oaf who just kind of thinks about his own personal desires, and it just reminds me of Thor. Whereas Jacob is more like Loki. He's conniving, he's deceptive, and long story short, he ends up stealing both his brother's blessing and birthright, which results on him being on the run from Esau and from his family. He's supposed to be gone for a few days, but he ends up being gone for over 20 years.
Yeah.
He goes off, he lives with Laban, and Laban is a good foil to Jacob. And they're with each other for a while. He marries 2 of Laban's daughters, not intentionally, but there's Leah and Rachel, and then he also ends up having 2 of their maidservants, Bilhah and Zilpah, and long story short, Jacob has 12 sons. They become the 12 tribes of Israel, give or take a little bit. There's some complexity there, but don't need to get into that. But in Genesis chapter 32, we find Jacob on his way back down to where he's finally going to reunite with his brother Esau.
Yes.
Right? And this is shortly before the story where we actually have, literally like right after this story that we're covering right here, Jacob is going to wrestle with God.
Yeah.
And his name is going to be changed to Israel, and it's a really cool story. But we're not there right now. Right now, we see Jacob going down, and he hears that, what we're going to see is he's going to hear that Esau is coming to meet him, and he is very nervous.
Tensions are high.
Yes. So, Jacob went on his way, and the angels of God met him. When Jacob saw them, he exclaimed, "This is the camp of God." So he named that place Mahanaim. Jacob sent messengers on ahead to his brother Esau in the land of Seir, the region of Edom. The region of Edom, just so y'all know, this is kind of like the land of Petra, if you've ever seen like Indiana Jones or Transformers or something like that. He commanded them, "This is what you must say to my lord Esau. This is what your servant Jacob says. I have been staying with Laban until now. I have oxen, donkeys, sheep, and male and female servants. I have sent this message to inform my lord, so that I may find favor in your sight." The messengers returned to Jacob and said, "We went to your brother Esau. He is coming to meet you and has 400 men with him." Jacob was very afraid and upset, so he divided the people who were with him into 2 camps, as well as the flocks, herds, and camels. If Esau attacks one camp, he thought, then the other camp will be able to escape. Then Jacob prayed, "O God of my father Abraham, God of my father Isaac, O Lord, you said to me, 'Return to your land and to your relatives, and I will make you prosper.' I am not worthy of all the faithful love, Hesed and Emeth." This is the one time I actually colored it in purple. And I'm pretty sure I did that right before we started this video, because I am not worthy of all the Hesed and Emeth that you have shown your servant. With only my walking stick I crossed the Jordan, but now I have become 2 camps. Rescue me, I pray, from the hand of my brother Esau, for I am afraid he will come and attack me, as well as the mothers with their children. But you said, I will certainly make you prosper, and will make your descendants like the sand of the seashore, too numerous to count. All right. So this is a very interesting occurrence of this term. All of these are actually different. Like, I've been struck by how different every occurrence is, because we didn't do any preparation here. Like, I went through and I made this PowerPoint, and I was like copying and pasting the passages and like highlighting the verse, like the word and stuff. But we hadn't actually read through these to like figure out. Like, we're literally just discussing this as we go, right? We're doing no preparation. We're just sitting down and recording. I've been struck by how different all these different occurrences are. But what do you think about this story here?
So the first thing that I thought was, it's interesting how he's saying he's not worthy of both Hesed and Emeth. Because usually you would think it would just be Hesed. But the fact that Emeth is there is interesting, especially because the birthright and the blessing, like, wasn't his. So, like, the truth of the covenant itself still stands, but it originally wasn't his, and he stole it. But now he has it, and he's saying, I'm not worthy of it all. So even, like, the truth itself of the covenant wasn't his. Yeah. But now he has, and he's like, oh, I'm not even worthy of that, because, I mean, it never was his to have. So that's kind of, it's kind of interesting in his circumstance that those two are together, and he's saying that he's not worthy of either. Yeah. Well, and specifically in regards to, like, the whole truth aspect of things and the faithfulness, there are multiple times where this is not just Jacob, like us as humans in general, we have done such horrible, sinful things that God would be totally justified in abandoning his promises, right? I mean, like, sometimes people think like, oh, well, God made this promise, like, he has to hold it.
Not really.
Yeah.
I mean, he could easily hop back out of it. I mean, the thing is, that's what's amazing about God's character is that he doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
Like, God is so truthful that he will be faithful to his promise regardless of what we do.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that's what Jacob's acknowledging here. He's like, I don't deserve this. Like, I have messed up a lot.
Yeah.
And for some reason, you never backed out of the promise.
Right.
Which God said would be the case, but I think Jacob was just marveling at that.
Which is the Hesed part. Like,
Yes,
then that's
exactly.
that's how they
They
pair
tie
together. Yeah.
Yeah, because he has no right to expect God to not back out. And so really the Hesed is what holds the truth together.
Right.
And so that's probably why you see those two things always tied together, because if God were just a God of truth and a God of faithfulness, well, many times he'd probably back out because we're unfaithful.
Right.
And so he'd be like, you know what? I don't have to be faithful to this group of people because, you know, I mean, like to go with the whole, sorry, this is going to be a little bit of a tangent here. Like the idea of like divorce, right? Jesus talks about how divorce is acceptable in terms of adultery. And so we have this principle that if somebody's been unfaithful to you, you have permission to get out of the covenant that you've made, right? Like that is kind of what Jesus says there. And so based on that principle, God can easily get out. All right. I mean, we are super unfaithful, so he has permission to get out, but it is his Hesed which keeps him emet, right?
Yeah.
Like it's the loving kindness of God that makes him faithful, that makes him a God of truth that maintains that. And so really these two things, they kind of are contrasted to each other, but they're the things that hold each other together.
Yeah.
His Hesed, like his loving kindness makes him faithful, and his faithfulness is what demonstrates his loving kindness, right?
Yeah.
They kind of just fuel each other.
Right.
But okay, let's walk through this. This video is going to be a little bit longer, but that's okay. So Jacob went on his way, and the angels of God met him. That's kind of a little moment where you kind of wish that you knew more about that story, but we don't really know a lot. When Jacob saw them, he exclaimed, "This is the camp of God," and so he named that place Machanaim. Jacob sent messengers on ahead to his brother Esau in the land of Seir, the region of Edom, because what we see is that Jacob, I believe in the previous chapter, he just made a covenant with Laban. Yeah, so he just made a covenant with Laban in chapter 31 because he'd run off from Laban, and Laban met with them, and they kind of just said, okay, you know what, we're going to part ways here.
Yeah.
And so Jacob literally is just re-entering into the promised land, right? He's re-entering into the land that is promised to Abraham and Isaac and to himself.
Yeah.
Right? It is the land of his inheritance. He just entered back into it. Right before he had left, he had actually received this vision from God, and he actually is going to allude to it in a second. He had received this vision from God where he saw like this stairway to heaven, right?
Yeah.
Led Zeppelin starts singing and stuff. No, he sees a stairway to heaven, and he tells God, "If you bring me back to this land, you will be my God," which is just a classic Jacob thing to say. He's just kind of conniving, and he doesn't know how to accept a gift from God, and so even whenever God is showing him this amazing revelation, he still feels like he has to fight for something, and he says, "You'll be my God if I get back to this land." And to his credit, Jacob does stay true to that promise. Really, he should have just said, "You'll be my God right now. You are the God of my father and my grandfather, and so you're my God." But he doesn't say that. He's like, "If you bring me back to the land, you'll be my God."
Right.
And so here we have in chapter 32, God has brought him back to that land, and so Jacob's going to call out to him. But whenever he gets there, first thing he does is he sends messengers to Esau because the reason he left the land was because he was on the run from Esau. And so he knows he needs to butter Esau up.
Right.
Because he's like, I don't
want to be killed.
Yeah, Esau's not going to be very happy with me. And so he's going to try to butter him up a little bit.
Yeah.
He commanded them and said, "This is what you must say to my lord Esau." Notice he says, "My lord Esau," Adonai. Right? It's like, okay, he's trying to posture himself as a servant.
Yeah.
"This is what your servant Jacob says." He says, "Your servant," right?
Yeah.
Ebed. "This is what your servant Jacob says. I have been staying with Laban until now. I have oxen, donkeys, sheep, and male and female servants. I have sent this message to inform my lord so that I might find favor in your sight." Basically, he's just saying, I've got a lot of stuff, and if you want any of it,
it's yours.
You just have to ask. Just kind of giving you a heads up. Don't take my life, take my prosperity.
Yeah.
The messengers returned to Jacob and said, "We went to your brother Esau." So now some time has passed. "We went to your brother Esau. He is coming to meet you and has 400 men with him."
Yikes.
So, as we're going to see, this is actually a big plot twist because whenever you get to the next chapter and they actually reunite, Esau just greets Jacob. And it seems like he's a mixture of maybe he forgave Jacob, maybe he just forgot about why he was mad to begin with.
Yeah.
But whenever Jacob hears that Esau's coming with 400 men, he immediately thinks this is an army.
Yeah.
And he thinks, oh,
They're after
crud,
him.
they're coming after me. So Jacob was very afraid and upset. So he divided the people who were with him into two camps, as well as the flocks, herds, and camels. So he's being strategic here. If Esau attacks one camp, he thought, then the other camp will be able to escape. So he's just thinking, you know what? We probably don't stand a chance against 400 men, because if they're armed men, we don't know. So if he attacks one, the rest will be able to get out of here.
Yeah.
And so Jacob's kind of just counting his cost right now.
Yeah.
And he's just kind of preparing for defeat. But then Jacob prayed. And this is kind of exciting because Jacob very rarely prays, but he finally cries out to God. And he says, "O God, O God of my father Abraham, God of my father Isaac, O Lord, you said to me, return to your land and to your relatives, and I will make you prosper." So he's calling to mind the promise of God, right? So you can see how it's setting up the word Hesed here. You told me to return to this land and to your relatives, and I will make you prosper. I am not worthy of all the Hesed and Emet that you have shown your servant. With only my walking stick, I crossed the Jordan, but now I have become two camps. And this is absolutely true. He's not even exaggerating here. In the previous moment that I talked about in chapter, 28, I think? Yes, chapter 28, whenever he saw the Stairway to Heaven thing. In that story, he literally had to lay down with his head on a rock because he had nothing. He literally left with nothing, but now he comes back and he's super rich. And so he's acknowledging that God has shown him faithfulness and prosperity even outside of the land. Rescue me, I pray, from the hand of my brother Esau, for I am afraid he will come and attack me, as well as the mothers with their children. But you said, I will certainly make you prosper, and will make your descendants like the sand of the seashore, too numerous to count. Right? So what his statement does here is it starts with a promise and it ends with a promise. And in the middle of it, he says, I'm not worthy of all the Hesed and Emet you have shown me. What do you make of that?
I feel like it's kind of appealing to God in the way. Like, the way that he's structuring it is he's talking about something that he know God supports. It's like, this is the covenant, this is the truth that you told me would happen. And then he's humbling himself and being a servant, like, okay, this is what's going on, and this is how I don't know that it's worthy, but this is what you said. So it's almost like he's appealing to God's own words in the situation.
Which is probably the wisest thing that he can do. This is something that we're going to see some of the greatest prayers in the Bible, which I would include this as one of the, like, a really good prayer. Usually, or just whenever people are talking to God, one of the best things to do is to remind him of the word that he said. Not because he needs to hear the reminder, but because it lets him know that you take his word seriously.
Yeah,
right?
That you recognize it too.
Yeah, and whenever you, I mean, this is just kind of a principle that you see throughout the Bible. Moses is going to do this a lot. You always remind God of what he said, because God is a God of Hesed and truth. And he is going to fulfill whatever he said. And so all you have to do is remind him. And so that Jacob's very wise here. He begins and ends with it, right? He begins with it so that, you know, it, like, if you're just thinking from a rhetorical perspective here, it immediately engages God's ears, right? Because you're saying, hey, this is what you said. And so immediately you're going to be like, oh, okay. Now, so what are the conclusions that you've arrived at based on what I said? That's what he says in the middle. But then he also ends with a quotation from what God said, so that, you know, God remembers what he said. Right? So he's saying, okay, you said this to me. Here's my appeal. And now remember, you said this to me too. And so you've got to, like, it's bookended with both of these promises of God. And Jacob says, this is what you said, and I'm expecting you to do this. He's not making a demand here. He's praying. He's requesting. But he's saying, I do expect it. But what he didn't expect was the faithfulness God showed him in between. Right? That's probably the thing. That's why Hesed is in the middle of it all. Right? He had no right to expect it, but it is the Hesed that God has shown him in the past 20 years that motivates him to pray this prayer. Back in Genesis 28, Jacob had said, if you bring me back to this land, you will be my God. And it seems like maybe he didn't expect to ever come back. But now here it is, chapter 32, he is coming back to the land, and he says, I am not worthy of the Hesed and Emet you have shown. Jacob's reflecting on his life, and he's like, I don't deserve this. Like, I put myself in this situation. Like, the reason, like, if Esau is coming to attack me, it's because I wronged him. I messed up. I did some stupid, terrible things. I'm not worthy of it. The way that I governed myself with Laban, not necessarily the best. The way that I've governed myself with all these different women that you've put in my life, not necessarily the best. I'm not worthy of this, but you have been faithful to me. And so now here I am, back in the land that you promised my ancestors, and you're my God. And so I'm going to call out to you, and because you gave me what I had no right to expect, I'm expecting that you will give me what I do have right to expect because you promised this to me.
Right.
Right? And so he's using his theology of God to shape his actions, right? Which is exactly what we should all do. He's saying, okay, God, you've been faithful in the past. I expect you to be faithful now. It's kind of like that one song that always gets on our nerves where it says, you haven't failed me yet.
Yes.
Right?
Oh, yeah.
Which I get what they're going for in that song. It's saying, you haven't failed me yet. Like, the implication is that in the past, you haven't failed me, and so you won't now.
You won't.
I just don't like that they put the word yet there because, like, it still gets the same thing across, right? You can just say, you haven't failed me, and the yet part is implied.
Yeah.
But whenever you say yet, it's almost like you're waiting for God to fail.
Yeah. Well, it adds like an area where, like, doubt can be in there. You know what I mean? So it's like,
Yeah, it's like, I get what they're going for, but it always annoys me.
Yeah.
But Jacob's kind of doing that thing right here where he's saying, you have not failed me. And the thing is, he had every right to expect God to fail him, not because God is a failure, but because he's a failure, and God had every reason to abandon him.
Right.
But God has shown him Hesed and truth. God fulfilled the promises to Abraham, even whenever Jacob was on the run from those promises. Even whenever he was outright fleeing from those promises, God was faithful to them. And so he says, okay, well, now I'm back in the land that you did promise. And so I expect that you'll probably be faithful then too. Right? If you showed your Hesed and Emet to me whenever I was running away from them, surely you're going to show your Hesed and Emet to me now that I'm coming back. Right? And so that really seems to be what Jacob's going for here. And this really is a transformative moment for Jacob because what he's going to do is after this whole little prayer right here, he's going to go across the river and he's going to wrestle with God. And it's going to be a kind of come to Jesus moment for Jacob. He's still not going to be perfect after this. He's going to mess up again and again, but he does seem to understand God a little bit better going forward here. And it's all because it really seems like the transformation moment is recognizing God's Hesed. Right? Like, I didn't deserve that. Like, that is what Hesed is. You don't deserve it. And that's why I like kind of the idea of grace being like to me, the more we talk about Hesed, I understand why it's translated so differently because it really is all of these different things.
Yes.
But to me, it probably is closest to the word grace.
Yes.
Because I think that grace also encapsulates a lot of the other things like selflessness and love and mercy and compassion. I think that grace implies all those things, but I think Hesed goes beyond grace as well. Because I think it's all of those things plus more. And so it seems like that really is the transformative moment for Jacob. He's like, because before it almost seems like he felt entitled to everything, right?
Right.
He's willing to fight for the blessing, fight for the birthright. It's his. But now in this moment, he's like, I don't deserve it.
Yeah.
And that's the thing that changes everything. And so, yeah. Do you have anything else that you think we should mention before we wrap this up?
I think something that's like kind of an application when it comes to like his prayer is I think a lot of times whenever we pray, well, I guess you could be on two sides of the spectrum when it comes to prayer. Some people have like issues when it comes to like asking God of request or like asking for different things, and some people like only do that, right? Yes. But I think here it's cool and it's a good thing to kind of base your prayers off of because he's asking of something but then also humbling himself that shows God that he isn't demanding for that to be something that he has. It's he's asking of it, but he's like, hey, I don't deserve it type of thing. So I think that's cool. Yeah,
well, it is very kind of similar to what the servant did in the previous one. Like where the servant said to Laban and the family, like, hey, this is what God is doing. And I'm pretty confident that you probably should do this, but I'm not going to expect it of you. Yeah. Right? Like, if you want to do something different, that is entirely your prerogative. But I think that this is what you should do. Right. It seems like Jacob's doing the same thing to God. He's like, God, you can do what you want. I'm just asking for deliverance. Yeah. But I think I know what you will do. Because I recognize I don't deserve this. And, like, so if you were willing to give me Hesed in the past, now that I'm actually turning to you, I'm expecting you'll probably still show me Hesed. Yeah. But it still is coming from a posture of humility. He's like, I'm not worthy. And I think that's always a good place to start your prayer. Yeah. Whereas like you're saying, a lot of times people pray and they almost go into it with this expectation of God will answer my prayer because I deserve it. Yeah. And that's not the right mindset. And that's usually why a lot of people end up being mad at God. because
Right,
they
blaming
think that they
him.
deserved an answer because, oh, I'm a Christian, therefore God must give me what I want.
Yeah.
And then they get mad at him when he doesn't. And it's like, well, yeah, you went about that the entire wrong way. No, it's no shocker that God didn't give what you wanted, because there's no telling what you would have done with it if he had given it to you.
Right.
Whereas really all of our prayers should be, it should start with I'm not worthy, and it should end with not my will but yours be done.
Yeah.
Right? That's really how all of our prayers should be. But Jacob's going about this like with a pretty strong expectation. He's like, you have explicitly promised me these things. And that's one place where he does have an advantage, where there's some things that we pray for that we don't have that necessary advantage. Like,
Right.
God, keep
Yes.
my children safe. It's like, okay, well, did God ever explicitly promise to keep your children from hardship? Not necessarily. It's still a good thing to pray,
Right.
but you can't get mad at God if something happens to the children. As sad as that is, in general, just raise the kids up right, and you won't have to worry. But you won't have to worry about where their souls are going. That's what I'm going for there. But there's different things that we pray, and we almost act as if God promised it to us. But in this instance, he actually does have explicit promises from God. You said that you would do this.
Yeah.
And you were faithful to stuff that you didn't even promise.
Yeah.
And so I'm expecting you will be faithful to the stuff that you did promise. And so,
And it shows the difference between this situation where he's not abusing Hesed versus back whenever it was Abraham and his wife, and the way that he used Hesed. Like, that was a abuse of it, and this is showing how you can use it correctly.
yeah. Which is even more shocking when we're talking about Hesed, because you would expect that Abraham would understand Hesed a lot better
More
than Jacob.
Yeah.
But if anything, maybe Abraham was a very faithful guy.
Yeah.
Jacob was very unfaithful for a lot of his life. And so maybe the unfaithful ones are the ones who understand Hesed better.
Yeah.
Because they are I think maybe a big aspect to understanding Hesed is understanding how much we don't deserve it. We have no right to it. And so, and don't get me wrong, I think that Abraham did demonstrate Hesed a whole lot.
Oh, yeah.
Because whenever we read the story, but it's just interesting that it pops up here.
Yeah.
And Jacob actually does understand it correctly.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so there we go. There is 5 more instances of Hesed in the book of Genesis.
Yep.
We only have 3 more to go, so high five there.
Yes.
Good job. We have covered 5, 6, 7, 8 out of the 11 occurrences in Genesis, and so I think we should be able to cover the next 3 in the next video.
I think we
and
can.
so this will be a 3-parter, and then we'll go into Exodus, where it's going to get really good, and we might even have to slow down a little bit, because there's some pretty significant moments in Exodus that really are going to define Hesed going forward.
Yes.
And so, yeah, thank you for joining me once again.
Yeah,
thank you all for
fun.
joining us. If you haven't done so already, be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell. Once again, eventually I will get this PowerPoint uploaded, and so you have access to it for free at nowletsbehonest.com/resources, which you can access by clicking in the link in the description down below or typing it in the URL box. And also, if you want to support me on Patreon, you can do that at patreon.com/David Tate. If you don't want to do that, that's totally fine. I still love you. I'm still glad you're here. But I also do appreciate that, because I'm just a struggling seminary student with a part-time job currently. And, that's always helpful. But, so thank you so much for joining us. And we will see you next time to be picking up with Genesis chapter 39.
Yeah.
And it's going to be a good time. Until then, be sure to keep a smile on your face. Don't let anybody steal your joy. Brianne, do you have anything that you want to say?
Be sure to comment if you have any insights or you have anything from this study that you thought was cool.
Yes,
we would like to read them.
Yes, I've been enjoying reading your comments. So, yeah. All right. Well, I'm David.
And I'm Brianne.
And this is Now Let's Be Honest. We will see y'all later. Bye.
Bye.
You read a verse, you sing a hymn, the money's in the plate. Sundays you mark out for him, but even then you show up late. You bought the shirt, you wear the cross, but sin throughout the week. For 30 shekels and a noose, you kiss him on the cheek.